Well, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends of HRNK and North Korea, delighted to see you this morning. Thank you very much for joining us. In particular, I would like to thank Ambassador Tani Sangrat, Ambassador to Thailand here in Washington, D.C. I would like to thank our colleagues and distinguished diplomats from the missions of Germany, Sweden, Norway, Liechtenstein, and also our colleagues from the State Department for joining us today. Of course, our speakers today, and the mission of Latvia as well. Welcome, thank you. Of course, all speakers today have been deeply and closely involved with North Korean human rights for a long time, including our keynote speaker today. I remember the days 10 years ago when we were working together on matters related to the UN COI. So this event is meant to be, of course, a celebration of the UN Commission of Inquiry report, which was published on the 7th of February, 10 years ago, exactly 10 years to the day. It was then presented at a press conference on the 17th of February 2014, and then it was submitted to the UN Human Rights Council on the 27th of March of the same year, 2014. Of course, celebrations have been going on, they come in due course. Today, we hope it's also an opportunity to look forward. It is also time to think of implementation of those recommendations of the UN COI that have not been implemented. There has been, of course, some success. There has been a certain degree of success, but we do have these luminaries here today who are going to speak to our distinguished audience in search of those answers and that more effective implementation. We are absolutely delighted to host our U.S. Special Envoy for North Korean Human Rights, Ambassador Julie Turner, as our keynote speaker today. Ambassador Turner was sworn in as Special Envoy on October the 13th, 2023. We've known her as a friend of civil society, a human rights expert in the Asia Pacific, North Korea for so many years. Most recently, she served as the office director at DRL, the Bureau for Democracy, Human Rights and Labor, at the U.S. Department of State. She's also director for Southeast Asia at the National Security Council. I'll mention it because I know it matters to her. She's a graduate, and to all of us, a graduate of Pepperdine University and the University of Maryland. Ambassador Turner, thank you for honoring us with your presence today. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Greg. And don't be scared. I know I'm carrying this big book. This is not my remarks, but I'll get to this in a little bit. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today, and particularly to see Ambassador King here, who was my predecessor in this role. I hope I do these remarks justice with you, having set such a high standard. But today's event marks the 10 years since the final report of the UN Commission of Inquiry on Human Rights in the DPRK. So I sat down yesterday thinking through what I was going to say today and read through the original UN press release that announced the public release of the report. And it included two extremely powerful quotes that I'm going to read back to you all today because I think they say it best. First, a wide array of crimes against humanity arising from policies established at the highest level of state have been committed and continue to take place in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. It goes on to say, the gravity, scale, and nature of these violations reveal a state that does not have any parallel in the contemporary world. This report was powerful in its meticulous documentation and its concrete recommendations for for how to improve respect for human rights and to promote the welfare of the North Korean people. It became a gold standard for commissions of inquiry and further solidified the international consensus that the human rights situation in the DPRK was and remains among the worst in the world. And this is why I brought this big book, because I wanted to show you all, this is my copy of the Commission of Inquiry. I don't have a nicely bound copy like Justice Kirby has, which some of you may have seen over the years, but mine is a big, heavy 400-page printout that is well-worn and very much marked up. And I hope, I brought this with me today to show you all just the usability of this report was unprecedented. I have, after 20 years of serving in the US government, in the democracy and human rights space, had many UN reports on my desk. Many that maybe I read the executive summary of, but with this particular product, I read the entire 400-page report. It is marked up with underlines, highlights, and pages are tabbed, and it has sat on my desk since it was released in 2014. And I regularly pull it off the shelf and flip through it and reference it. In thinking through the power and impact of this document, I want to point back to another line in that initial February 17th press release from the UN, which said, "The fact that the DPRK has for decades pursued policies involving crimes that shock the conscience of humanity raises questions about the inadequacy of the response of the international community. The international community must accept its responsibility to protect the people of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea from crimes against humanity, because the government of the DPRK has manifestly failed to do so." Here we are, gathered here today, 10 years later, and I believe those words continue to ring true. The human rights situation in the DPRK remains among the worst in the world. COVID has only allowed the regime to further tighten its restrictions. Global crises have also continued to pull the international community's attention away from the North Korea situation. As we take a moment today to review the past 10 years, I hope we will all be re-energized to take action, to press for concrete change. The United States will continue to call upon Kim Jong-un and the DPRK government to respect the human rights of the North Korean people, to allow the North Korean people freedom of movement, freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, freedom of association, and freedom of religion and belief. We urge the DPRK to come to the table. We're prepared to have an open conversation about human rights. Let's talk directly about how we can work together to realize the implementation of the recommendations laid out in the COI report. The international community also has opportunities to carry forward the recommendations laid out in the COI. The US continues to call upon all member states, including the People's Republic of China, to abide by the principle of non-refoulement. The international community also has opportunities to press further on accountability measures through the upcoming UN Human Rights Council session and the annual resolution that's considered there at the HRC, and later this year through the DPRK's Universal Periodic Review process. The UN Security Council also has a role to play in responding to the UN COI's findings. The DPRK's human rights record is inextricably linked to international peace and security. And the Security Council has previously considered this connection between peace and security and human rights in North Korea, and we hope to carry that forward in 2024 as well. I know many of you in the room today and listening to today's event have been advocating tirelessly for human rights in North Korea. Some for many decades, and it's great to see so many familiar faces here. I just want to extend a thank you for your continued commitment to the North Korean people. And to also say, don't give up. Please continue your efforts to shine a spotlight on the situation in the DPRK and to call for concrete change and respect for rights. And to the people of the DPRK, I'd like to say the COI lifted the veil on the suffering and abuses of the people of North Korea. We see what's happening, and we will continue to work to promote respect for rights and to advance the dignity and the welfare for all North Koreans. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Turner. Before we get started, we're distributing 2 documents today. One of them is a booklet based on the UN COI report. It reads very well, unlike other UN reports, as Justice Kirby says. I'm just quoting him, but nevertheless, this is an excerpt of the key findings and recommendations. The other document was put together by our colleagues at PS Core in South Korea. It is based on the very successful Camp David Trilateral Summit. The USA and our friends, allies, and partners, the Republic of Korea and Japan, and this focuses on the human rights aspects arising from the summit. Both of our panelists are members of the board of directors of the U.S. Committee for Human Rights in North Korea, HRNK. Roberta Cohen is co-chair emeritus of our board. She's well known for many good reasons. One of them being internationalizing the issue of IDPs, internally displaced persons. She has authored numerous articles on topics pertaining to North Korean human rights. She has appeared before the U.S. Congress. She has testified before the UN Commission of Inquiry. The 3 justices has been a true guiding light of this movement and this organization. Ambassador Robert King, as we all know, is the previous special envoy for North Korean human rights. He worked on Capitol Hill for 25 years. Out of those 25 years, for 24 years, he worked with Congressman Tom Lantos as his chief of staff. As we remember, he was the only Holocaust survivor to sit in the U.S. Congress. Ambassador King is the author of 5 books, a true scholar of not only North Korean human rights, but many other related topics. He has also authored more than 50 articles on international relations, international affairs, and human rights. Ambassador King, would it be okay if I asked you to get us started?
Sure, I'm happy to do whatever you'd like. It's a particularly auspicious occasion to get together and commemorate the publication of a human rights report, the North Korean Human Rights Report by the United Nations. This was the day 10 years ago on which that report appeared. And I think it's useful to go back and look at what happened and think about what we do, where we go from here in terms of how we move forward on human rights in the context of North Korea. The creation of the Commission of Inquiry was spearheaded by Marzuki Darusman. Darusman was a prominent attorney in Indonesia. He was former Attorney General of Indonesia, was responsible for the successful trial against one of the military leaders who was involved in the authoritarian government there. After he left government service in Indonesia, he became the special envoy for North Korean human rights issues under the UN Human Rights Council. He was appointed in 2010, served until 2016. And during those 6 years, he was very active and involved in terms of pressing North Korea on human rights issues and organizing international cooperation to deal with that. Darusman came in 2010, as I said. In 2013, the decision was taken by the Human Rights Council to create the Commission of Inquiry. It was largely due to Dorisman's working behind the scenes, his efforts to create support. I worked very closely with him in terms of ensuring American support for his efforts, and that was not a particularly easy conversation. There were people in the United States government who were concerned about creating a commission of inquiry on North Korea human rights. This might have a negative effect in terms of dealing with the problems of nuclear missile issues that were a high priority. The Commission of Inquiry had little impact. The North Koreans were not interested in giving up missiles or negotiating on their missiles. And it was very helpful and very important that we continue and press the North Koreans with the creation of this commission. Dorisman was very important in terms of setting up in the Human Rights Council the proper procedures so that we were able to get a vote and that we were able to have a very successful effort in terms of bringing the commission into creation. When the commission was created, Michael Kirby, whom you heard this morning, played a very important role in terms of organizing and structuring the commission. And Sonja Biserko, who you also heard this morning, played a very important role in terms of raising issues and moving things forward. It was very helpful and very useful to have that commission manned by people of such stature and such valued judgment, and it was a very useful kind of thing to do that. The report, as the report was being prepared, the commission had a series of hearings, public hearings and some private hearings in South Korea. They had a couple of days of hearings, raising issues and discussing issues in Japan, dealing with the Japanese abductees. There were meetings that were held in Geneva. I believe they had meetings in Brussels as well. There were also 2 days of meetings here in Washington, where a number of important witnesses testified about their experiences. And the net result was that in basically less than 6 months, they were able to produce a 400-page report that has certainly stood the test of time. Their efforts were recognized in Human Rights Council, where the report was praised, widely praised, a resolution acknowledging the value of the report was adopted by an overwhelming vote. There were only, the Human Rights Council is not composed of all UN member states. There are 45 or 46 members who are members of the Human Rights Council. Membership rotates, although not every country has sat on the Human Rights Council. They have to be voted in. Interestingly enough, South Korea has sat on the council very, very frequently. North Korea has never been a member. That's probably an indication of North Korea's human rights record. But the council endorsed the report. The report was taken up by the UN General Assembly. It was praised and endorsed and approved by a very large margin. The recommendation that we raised at the Security Council was something that raised questions. The Chinese, the Russians were very unhappy about raising the issue, and they made their unhappiness known during the discussions. The UN session, the Security Council session, was held at the end of 2014, just after the report came out. And it was an interesting session. I was able to go up to the meeting. The Samantha Power, was the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations at that time. And I was sitting with her father, who happened to be in town. This was on December 23rd. We didn't let Christmas get in the way of human rights, although some argue that we were violating human rights by not letting people finish their shopping. We had an interesting conversation as we went through the discussion. The South Korean ambassador, who sat on the Security Council as a member, South Korea was a member at that time, gave his last speech as a member of the Security Council. This was the last meeting of the Security Council in 2014. And the South Korean ambassador gave a magnificent speech. I think everybody who was there recognized, you could hear a pin drop when he spoke. That was not true with most other speakers. The effect of that was remarkable in terms of recognizing the importance of the human rights issues. Looking back on the events that took place during that first period, initially after the report came out, there's no question that it had a significant impact in raising the profile and raising the information about human rights violations in North Korea. We continued, there were 3 or 4 subsequent meetings of the Security Council, which discussed North Korea human rights. We then ran into a change in administrations in Washington, which didn't support the discussion of North Korea human rights issues. We've been able to resume that, and last August there was a Security Council session that was devoted to the issue of North Korea human rights, and it's very useful, very important, and very helpful to have that. As we look back over what's happened in this first decade of since the adoption of the report, there are several things that I think indicate the value of it and that are important and that justify and verify the importance of proceeding with the commission report. When Marzuki Darusman served as special rapporteur, he sought repeatedly to go to North Korea. He approached them formally. He also made similar requests to the Chinese. The Chinese politely said, thank you, but no. The North Koreans didn't bother to respond. But Darusman was very interesting. After the report had come out, as the UN General Assembly was taking it up in early fall of 2014, Darusman was approached by the North Koreans and basically was told, if you can, make sure that Kim Jong-un is not blamed for anything, and if you can make some changes, then you can come pay us a visit in Korea. Marzuki and I had lunch in New York during the time this was taking place. And, he said, I'm encouraged that the North Koreans are willing to discuss this, but there are certain things that I will not do in order to get a meeting with the North Koreans. And he talked about he said, number one, we can't change the report. The report has been published, it is there, it is out, and we're not going to make any changes. And we had a lengthy discussion about it. And one of the more interesting lunches that I've had. We talked about this, and basically he said, my inclination is to say yes, but no changes. And if they're willing to do that, that's fine. If they're not, I'm not going to back down. And I said, the United States will support you in that. we have absolutely strong confidence in what you're doing and the value of what you're doing, and we'll continue with that. The North Koreans clearly were concerned about the report. They were very unhappy that Darusman wasn't willing to change the report and made their unhappiness known. But there were some interesting things that did happen. One of the things that occurred is that about the time the Human Rights Report came out, the North Koreans went through the process of the Universal Periodic Review. This was mentioned earlier. It's a process by which the UN Human Rights Council goes through every country member of the UN once every 4.5, 5 years and talks about their human rights situation. They go through with everybody, the United States, Britain, France, Russia, China, and everybody. It's just part of the process of what we do. And the first time the North Koreans participated in the Universal Periodic Review was in 2010. I was there in Geneva for the discussion of it. We went through the discussion with North Korea. There were a lot of questions that were raised during the process. This Universal Periodic Review is basically a self-criticism. You talk about what your view is of how you deal with human rights. Of course, the North Koreans said, we do a great job, we're doing wonderful things, all is well in North Korea. But then there's the opportunity to discuss the reports that are given. And in the case of North Korea, there were a number of countries who had comments to make on their report and questions that were raised. And it was a very interesting session. This is the case with all countries. The United States, we talk about our human rights record. We say this is what we're doing, this is where we feel like we've got shortcomings, this is what we're doing to address them. And other countries then proceed to ask questions. Just an aside, one of the things that was interesting is the United States, we do well on human rights. There certainly are areas where we can improve. One of the things that several countries like China and North Korea and others, raised were the question of treatment of Native Americans. And there's no question that that is a problem. This is one of the issues that came up in the United States at the Universal Periodic Review the first time. And we went through, we talked about what we did, we acknowledged our mistakes. The interesting thing is the next U.S. ambassador appointed to the Human Rights Council was a Native American attorney. And he was a good guy. He was an advocate on human rights. And it certainly made clear that we do have respect for Native Americans. It doesn't mean we've reached the final solution in terms of dealing with all of these problems. But in the case of North Korea, the North Koreans, in their first Universal Periodic Review, said we don't have any problems. They heard 125 suggestions. And at the end, the countries go through and say, we appreciate these suggestions. These are areas we think we can make improvement or change. These are areas we disagree with you on. North Koreans announced that they weren't going to respond on any of the 125 recommendations that were made. First time that I've ever seen the Human Rights Council explode with countries saying, this isn't the way we do things. You respond, you have a responsibility. They went into a recess for a period of time, and finally the North Koreans ended up not making any comments about any of the suggestions that were made. 4 years later, shortly after the report came out, North Korea went through the same process for the Universal Periodic Review, submitted its report, listened to the criticisms and questions and critiques, and said, oh, these are useful suggestions. We'll look at them more carefully. These are some areas where we think we can make progress. We made progress in this area, we made progress in other areas. And in fact, the North Koreans said, we're going to go back and comment on the 125 suggestions that we didn't comment on 4 years ago because we think there are some things that should be said. The North Koreans clearly were not happy about what happened with the human rights, with the report, the Commission of Inquiry. And they were responding in a way that I think was positive, suspicious but positive. One of the things that was helpful is that the North Koreans did not invite Marzuki Darasman to visit, but they did invite the Special Rapporteur for Persons with Disabilities. This is a much less sensitive issue. North Korea has, in fact, made progress on dealing with persons with disabilities, and that we should be encouraged in North Korea. We should recognize this and acknowledge it. Persons with disabilities has far less impact on North Korea than freedom of information. And for that reason, it was an issue that I think they considered a safe issue, but it's one that they were willing to engage with the UN on, and that was encouraging and that was positive. And that, I think, was an outgrowth of the Commission of Inquiry. So I think there are useful things that came out of the Commission of Inquiry that we need to acknowledge, we need to recognize. Are we there yet? No. And I think it's important that we continue to press the North Koreans. North Koreans, in fact, probably backslid. Is that the right word? They were backsliding on the human rights issues, the progress that they made. COVID was a problem, difficulty of having the UN Human Rights Council discussions. But I'd say that we've made progress, and we don't need to draw the conclusion that because there isn't a free press in North Korea today, that the Human Rights Report, the Commission report was not useful. That's not a valid conclusion. We're moving in the right direction. We've got to continue to press the North Koreans. This isn't going to be a great step forward and suddenly the millennium breaks out. This is something that is going to take continued effort on our part and on all other countries that are involved and share our values. And I think we need to continue to do that. I don't want to sound pessimistic because I think the human rights effort with North Korea, the adoption of the report, the requirement for the Commission of Inquiry report, has been a major step forward. And I think we need to recognize that, but not rest on our laurels and continue to press the North Koreans on human rights issues on the basis of that report and our continuing efforts. I've gone on way too long, Greg, and I apologize.
Such a treat. Thank you so much.
Good morning, everyone. It's really an honor to be part of a commemoration of the 10th anniversary. My greatest respect and admiration to Michael Kirby, Sonja Biserko, and Marzuki Darasman for their extraordinary work, and also for the many members of the North Korean diaspora, I would say, or those witnesses who very courageously spoke at the hearings that were held. Let me begin my remarks by repeating the words of Justice Michael Kirby, who said so eloquently in 2014 at the UN Security Council, if ever there is to be a case for referral of a matter to the International Criminal Court, it is difficult to imagine a stronger case than has been laid out in the case of North Korea. The COI report makes that case, High Commissioner for Human Rights, to discuss the question of accountability for those responsible for the crimes committed. Although China and Russia have blocked referral of the North Korean case to the International Criminal Court. The conference will consider alternative judicial and non-judicial measures. And HRNK's executive director, Greg Scarlatti, will be participating. That should be an important conversation in follow-up to the COI report. And later this month in Geneva, the UN Human Rights Council, the UN's main body for dealing with human rights, and the body that Bob King mentioned endorsed the COI report, will be having to acknowledge its 10th anniversary. I hope the Council not only commends the COI report, but will call for an assessment of the implementation of its recommendations. North Korea does not appear to have carried out the recommendations having to do with crimes against humanity. It has taken some steps in the field of disability, and Ambassador King mentioned those, and there are unconfirmed reports of reforms in ordinary prisons, but these need to be verified. An assessment would be in order, together with strategies for improving implementation. The UN should also consider an update to the COI report based on the COI report, but that looks at the impact that Kim Jong-un's rule has had on human rights. Kim largely consolidated his power after the publication of the COI report. An update would have to look at the purges and executions, including of family members, that solidified his rule. It will look at the virtual lockdown of the country that he authorized in response to the pandemic, which, according to the UN, badly affected the right to food, health care, movement, livelihood in the country. Kim Jong-un also introduced new restrictions on foreign information, in particular on South Korean and other foreign films, TV dramas, or news reports, and he has authorized a new law targeting young people's access to foreign culture. Clearly, the Kim regime fears the growing consumption of foreign media before the pandemic, and the younger generation's fads and preferences. The BBC reported a public sentencing in 2022 of 2 teenage boys to 12 years hard labor for watching and maybe storing South Korea K-dramas. If a trigger for change is developing in North Korea, the consumption of foreign media by youth may be an early warning signal. Let me highlight some issues I believe that should be given special emphasis in any update and that reinforces the COI report. First, the right to leave the country. As far as I can ascertain, North Korea has become the worst offender of this right in the world, and that has to be looked at. Since the pandemic, border controls have increased, surveillance intensified, shoot-to-kill orders reinforced, additional fences constructed, and family members punished. The result? Only 67 North Koreans were able to escape in 2022, 196 in 2023, compared to some 2,900 in 2009, and that was pre-Kim Jong-un. And the latest figures, I believe, include North Korean diplomats and trade officials defecting from outside the country. I would strongly recommend that the UN missions of South Korea, the US, Canada, the EU, both in Geneva and New York, show the film Beyond Utopia to as many other countries as possible. As you probably know, the film shows the harrowing escape of a North Korean family, which has to transit China to Southeast Asia and then to South Korea. And it also shows the punishment awaiting another family whose son escaped but then was turned back to China. I think the film dramatically says what we all tried to say in many different words. And my experience of watching that film with others is that the others, even though if they know about North Korea, have said, oh, I didn't know it was this bad. It just somehow comes across to them. And I think it's important at the UN with other governments to be showing that film, particularly those in the Human Rights Council who will be looking at the 10th anniversary. A second issue I would highlight is the chronic hunger reported in the country. The COI report, in a very notable chapter, warned that many of the policies that led to crimes against humanity during the Great Famine remain in place. And I want to just give their listing. This is the COI report listing, because I believe you'll see how relevant it is today. Prioritizing military spending even in times of famine. Privileging certain groups in parts of the country. Preventing public discourse about economic solutions. Cracking down on coping mechanisms like informal markets. Enforcing a travel ban on already starving people. Evading meaningful agricultural reforms. Providing misleading information about the food situation. Delaying international assistance. And we know that UN agencies and NGOs have been waiting to go back in. And placing restrictions on aid when it arrives. The former German ambassador to North Korea, Thomas Schaffer, who spent more than 8 years in the country, wrote in 2021 that North Korean officials will tell you that climate, topography, and UN sanctions are the reasons for the hunger. But in his view, the major problem is government policy. Most notably, the lack of incentives for farmers, and also the fear that outside economic ideas might diminish political control. Third, the impact of North Korea's increased militarization on human rights. That should be given emphasis. Development is diverting resources from badly needed food and health care. Between 11 and 16 million people a year have been reported without sufficient food over the past decade, while North Korea launches spy satellites and tests ICBMs. The government further takes most of the wages from workers it sends abroad and applies that money to governmental priorities, whether weapons or luxury items for the elite. Forcing much of the population to do labor further lends support to military priorities. As for prison labor, HRNK has identified a possible connection to nuclear weapons development. Having a UN update will reinforce the findings in the COI report and shine a light on the last 10 years. It will also define an agenda for human rights dialogue and diplomacy as called for in the COI report. I would urge everyone to continue to press for the opening up of the country and bringing in as much information as possible so that its population can begin to again hear about COI findings and think about choices they might have beyond hereditary dictatorship. It was encouraging to hear that at least half of the 6,000 North Korean defectors interviewed by the Ministry of Unification in South Korea questioned the hereditary rule system in North Korea. I hope the UN can develop a strategy to gain access not only for humanitarian organizations, but for UN human rights experts, and for organizations like the ICRC, which can visit prisons. The 10th anniversary is a good occasion to review the report, update it with Kim Jong-un's rule, and identify new strategies for going forward. And I very much agree with the remarks of the Sonja Biserko and Shin-wha and Michael Kirby about not losing faith and continue with dedication, because changes will eventually take place. Thank you.
Roberta, thank you very much. We have a little bit of time left, and we are ready to take questions. Professor Maxwell, member of the HRNK Board of Directors, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for both your great presentations. Really provided insight I certainly had not heard before, so I think we're all grateful for that. Roberta already answered my question, which was only 3 words: what is next? And I was going to ask, do we need a follow-up? And so she's outlined that. So I'll just change it around a little bit and really go with Roberta's last statement. How do we gain and maintain momentum on human rights? What should we do in addition to what's outlined in the report? What are some of the concrete actions governments and perhaps civil society can do to maintain the momentum and really to not lose faith? I think that's a great way to look at this. Thank you.
I think that basically we need to continue the effort. This is not something that's, you do something once, it's done. This is an effort that's going to require continued work, continued effort to underline what the North Koreans are doing. I think HRNK does a very good job of singling out where there are problems, identifying what the issues are. I think we need to continue that effort. I think the kinds of things that Julie Turner is doing in terms of working with other countries, with gathering support for human rights in North Korea is extremely important, because this is not something that NGOs can do by themselves. This is something that requires government effort, and the United States, in spite of the fact that we haven't renewed the North Korea Human Rights Act, continues to have an interest, a concern, and a desire to make progress on the human rights. The UN is key to the whole process, and we need to give more effort, energy, in terms of moving forward. But again, this isn't a flash and it's done. This is something that takes a lot of effort over a long period of time, and that's what we're going to have to do to deal with it.
And let me mention, we have a lot of very good players now. We've heard from Julie Turner from the United States, who is new now in this position. We've heard from Shin-wha in South Korea, and a lot of the NGOs come together, and that'd be very important to sort of bring them together behind different issues to bring up at the Human Rights Council. And so I think the players are in place, they're there, and then the question of what you do, globalizing the issue, and very important to gain as many states as you can in the Human Rights Council to be supportive of some real action on North Korea. And it's important to look at the membership of the council, and it's important to have both governments and NGOs approaching these members and seeing again this film that I mentioned, because I think that will bring a number of governments together who haven't seen the film and don't know about it. And it really brings to life a good part of the problem. And there will be many different meetings, and I hope that they are filled with a lot of good dedication and ideas of how to move this forward. You have an opportunity with the 10th anniversary to kind of mobilize all the different ideas and possibilities. And I also hope this booklet will go around. This booklet, which is on your places, is really the COI report. Michael Kirby had wanted something like this, where you just are repeating the recommendations of the report in a very readable form and with pictures, and which you can just pass out, and HRNK will be, I believe, organizing distribution.
Thank you very much. We'll go to Stanley Kober next. Stanley, please wait for the mic.
In discussing policy options, what I just heard, a lot of focus on the United Nations. When the Cold War ended, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, Bush and Gorbachev met in Helsinki, there was cooperation. President Bush said the UN is now working the way it's supposed to be. Those days are gone. They're gone. The United Nations is now divided. Security Council is now divided. You can't imagine Putin meeting with President Biden like that, even meeting with President Xi. And that is the problem I have. If we are putting so much reliance on the United Nations, and if the United Nations is now so divided, what are the prospects for helping the people of North Korea to get a better life?
We used to have a television program called the $64,000 question. I think the rates have gone up, but sounds like it. I can just say that having been around for a long time, prior to the collapse of the Soviet Union, no one was really predicting it. Times were very, very tough for the Soviet dissident movement. They were being arrested. There were all kinds of exiles, and I was working on those issues then. And nobody seemed to really have a clue that something was going to happen much bigger and that some problems were going to get resolved. So I think we didn't know about what was going to happen. Right now is a terrible time, and that's where you have to continue to just forge ahead, really, with dedication. And I remember writing that about dealing with the Soviet Union a number of years before the actual collapse and change. So I think that I mentioned getting a lot of information into North Korea. It's very interesting to think about when you see all the restrictions going on in the country, what may be underlying that. How much support is there in the country for this regime? How many political prisoners are there who are obviously there and are somehow out of sync with that government? How many are trying to leave? I mean, we know that the numbers have gone down, but just think that tens of thousands have been sent back by China over the years. If you start adding up all these people, you begin to think that there is a kind of opposition or questioning within that ought to be looked at and supported. I think we are looking to try to support the North Korean people in the country at this time. And perhaps the global tensions I will leave for a United States representative to comment on, and discussions with China or with Russia, but there can be discussions with many other countries. There are other global groupings forming that I think are important to deal with. And if the situation in North Korea appears as bad as it is, and there is a really vocal mobilization of NGOs, governments behind it, it becomes more difficult even for major powers that are going in a very bad direction, makes it more difficult then to maintain that. I don't think anybody questions, and they should not be allowed to question, in the sense that the situation in North Korea is one of the worst in the world as far as human rights is, and that should always be clear so that it's difficult to then try to be contrary to that. But I think now we're going through a very tough time, and I'll just end with maybe an amusing story that popped into my mind that I think is relevant. I lived in Ethiopia during the communist domination of the country, and the Soviet Union was dominant there. And when I left, I guess it was about 6 years later that the communist regime fell in Ethiopia. Nobody knew when it would. It seemed hard as, with all the security forces and whatever. But there was a joke that began going around Addis Ababa, and I just wondered about North Korea. I know they're very different. And in this, a little boy or girl was asked, who is your mother? And the answer, she said, Mother Russia. And who's your father? Oh, my father is Vladimir Lenin, or maybe it was Mengistu. And what do you want to be when you grow up? And the answer was, an orphan. And this was going around the city all the while that there was a very strong consolidation of Soviet domination. I was at the United States Embassy, and that little joke showed that something was rumbling underneath somewhere. And I would think of a joke like that if that ever came into Pyongyang. But it sounds like it may be beginning to when you look at the survey that's been done by the Ministry of Unification in South Korea about North Korean defectors who are often quite indoctrinated, even though they leave, about the Kim family. And here is a real questioning of that hereditary succession and dissatisfaction with Kim Jong-un. So I think you should keep your eye also there, and then plan strategies. And it's amazing how sometimes times do change.
Thank you very much. Humor in North Korea would be a great topic for a future program. Speaking of future programs, please allow me to engage in a shameless exercise in self-promotion. Our colleague Michael Maya from the International Bar Association is here. We have completed a documentary based on our investigation of crimes against humanity at detention facilities, in particular short-term detention facilities. Please stay tuned. We're working on a series of events, and you're great friends of HRNK and the people of North Korea, so please expect to hear from us. Let me thank our co-chair emeritus, Roberta Cohen, Ambassador Robert King, Ambassador Julie Turner, for their terrific remarks today. And let me thank all of you for having joined us. I look forward to the next HRNK program. Stay safe, stay warm. I look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you.